Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Celine. I am a second-year student in the Master's Conservation Program here at UCLA and partnered with the Getty. I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker for today, Charles Brian Rose. But before I do that, I would like to just say that the Coates Institute at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honukbatam, Ahihirom, and Ayuhinkem, past, present, and emerging. I also want to share a fun little fact I learned about the Gabrielino Tongva tribe. They have a historical site actually right across the street from my apartment here in Los Angeles. Some of their springs, known as the Kuruvunga Springs, are actually at the site of the University High School here in Los Angeles. So they have a lot of different areas here that you can go and visit, and I will be looking for these springs next time I go. Outside for a nice walk on my break. But without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Charles Brian Rose. He is an American archaeologist, classical scholar, and author. He is the James B. Pritchard Professor of Archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania in the Classical Studies Department and the Graduate Group in the Art and Archaeology of the Mediterranean World. He is also the Peter C. Ferry Curator in Charge of the Mediterranean section of the Penn Museum and was the museum's Deputy Director from 2008 to 2011. He has served as the President of the Archaeological Institute of America and currently serves as Director for the Gordian excavations and as head of the post-Bronze Age excavations at Troy. Rose received his BA from Haverford College and his PhD in Art History and Archaeology from Columbia University in 1987 for his thesis titled Julio-Claudian Dynastic Group Monuments. Rose has received a number of awards and fellowships. It would take me a while to list them all, but including the Gold Medal of the Archaeological Institute of America in 2015. His publications have focused on the archaeological sites of Troy and Gordian and on the political and artistic relationship between Rome and the provinces. For nearly a decade, Rose has also offered pre-deployment education and training for armed forces personnel bound for Iraq and Afghanistan to emphasize cultural heritage awareness and protection. Soldiers learn about the region's historical backgrounds, heritage and resources, site recognition, emergency salvage, and conservation. He currently serves on the Advisory Council of the Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage and on the Board of Directors of the Council of American Overseas Research Centers. So thank you all, and I will hand it over to you, Brian.
Okay, thank you, Celine, and thanks to all of you for joining me today. It's an honor to have the opportunity to give this talk, and I've focused it on three issues: archaeology, museums, and conservation, as you see. And I'll talk primarily about my own experience as an archaeologist dealing with the science of conservation and exploring how I acquired a knowledge of conservation. This will entail the experiences that I've had at three particular archaeological sites in Turkey, starting with Aphrodisias in the Southwest. When I was a graduate student at Columbia, I worked there for 5 years. That was the beginning of my interaction with what conservation is and what one shouldn't do within the larger sphere of conservation. Then Troy in Northwestern Turkey, where I was co-director of excavations for 25 years, and now Gordian in West Central Turkey, where I've been either co-director or director since 2007. And all of them have been fundamental in terms of my acquisition of knowledge about the importance of conservation and how to approach it as an archaeologist. When I started out, I knew nothing. And this is going to, those of you who are conservators, which is the majority of you, this is going to be like fingernails on a chalkboard. So when I began at Aphrodisias, so this is me at Aphrodisias in 1980, I really had no idea about conservation. I was in a graduate program in art history and archaeology, but conservation wasn't something that anyone discussed. And when I got to Aphrodisias, where there were easily 30 coins found per day, as well as a large number of life-size marble reliefs of the 1st century AD. We were excavating the structure called the Sebastion at that point. There were only 8 of us on the staff, and the director, Kenan Aram, said, well, you'll be the conservator. And I said, I don't know anything about conservation. You don't want to make me the conservator. And he said, there's nothing to it. With the marble reliefs, we'll have somebody else come in and deal with those. All you have to do is to conserve the small finds and the coins. And I said, but again, I have no idea what to do. And he said, well, I have a box of dental tools. And so that's really all you need to use. Take the dental tools and clean the coins and the terracotta figurines. Now, I say these words and I think, what must people be thinking of me? But this was admittedly 40 years ago. I've come a long way since then, but I'm showing it to indicate that in grad school, students of archaeology often are still not exposed to conservation to the extent that they should be. And I like to think that that's less true at my own institution, Penn, than in other places, but we still have a long way to go. It was only when I got to, still at Aphrodisias, I was dealing with architectural conservation as well, which is the kind of conservation I've dealt with most extensively throughout my life. And the architectural conservators at Ephesus, which was not far from Aphrodisias, would often come and take us to Ephesus and teach us about the principles of architectural conservation. The one who did this the most was a man named Friedman Weber, who restored the Library of Celsus at Ephesus in upper left, and also was the first to begin the strategic plan for conserving the tetrapylon at Aphrodisias, which you see in lower right. He was the first one to teach me about the Charter of Venice and to help me understand that if I were ever to be in a position where I had to develop a master plan for architectural conservation involving ancient structures, that I should always be careful to distinguish the ancient structure from modern interventions, and yet to do so in a way that didn't detract from the aesthetic integrity of the original structure. And as a kind of case in point, he showed me what he had done at the Library of Celsus, again, upper left, dating to the beginning of the 2nd century AD, where, as you can see, ancient and modern are clearly distinguished. The columns that are modern are easily detectable, but from a distance, you're not hit over the head with their modernness. So he has been able to walk, or I thought at the time and still do, that he had been able to walk the kind of tightrope that one needs to walk in following the Charter of Venice when one is doing architectural conservation. And he was very good at helping me understand that if an object or a building or a painting has been destroyed, that destruction is part of its biography and it must never be hidden. So as an example, he showed me what he had done with the pediments of the Library of Celsus, and also for that matter with the tetrapylon. He hadn't done infill except when it was necessary to stabilize the structure. Ephesus was a good place to learn about this because they had at the time the best in architectural conservation and the worst in architectural conservation. So shortly before I went to Ephesus for my training in architectural conservation, a number of structures, I was about to say were conserved. No one would call this conservation. The elements of ancient structures were raised up again, which is different, obviously, from conservation. And at the time, in the 70s, there was an interest in showing the difference between modern elements and ancient elements. And so you look at some of these structures, the Nymphaeum of Trajan, the Monument of Memmius, or perhaps the worst of the group, the Flavian Sebastion, where admittedly you can see dramatically the difference between ancient marble and modern concrete. But of course, it's committing a sin against the ancient structure, and it means that visitors have absolutely no idea what it is you're trying to tell them. Now at Troy, there was a lot of architectural conservation with which I had to deal because wrapped around the walls of Troy are the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so every visitor who comes, not every visitor, but many of the visitors who come to Troy, and this is especially true after the Troy film in 2004, wanted to climb the late Bronze Age fortification walls that surrounded the site to pretend that they were either Achilles or Brad Pitt were somewhere in between. And of course, these walls were built in 1400 BC, so they're 3,400 years old. And as they would try to climb the walls, they would pull the stones out from the walls. So we had a lot of infill that we had to do because the walls were in danger of tumbling. And again, I brought Friedman Weber from Ephesus to help us with the master plan. What we did with the infills, as you can see in upper right, we used small stones. So one could easily see that these are modern additions, but we put the small stones together in conglomerates that approximate the dimensions of the original ancient stones. So anyone coming up to the wall can see what we did, but standing back at a distance, you don't find it jarring, the modern interventions. So again, we were trying to follow as scrupulously as we could the regulations of the Charter of Venice. You see the same sort of thing in the lower slides, what the monument looked like before we started and then after we finished. Anyone who comes here can see what it is we did, but the poetry of Troy is still wrapped around the monuments. When you're digging an archaeological site like Troy, or any archaeological site that is a multi-period settlement with a convoluted history and an enormous amount of material that you have to deal with, this is going to be an expensive project. You need to raise phenomenal sums of money every year. And if your discoveries are not as phenomenal as your donors wanted them to be, you can get panicky as an archaeologist. And this was something that happened at Troy in the 1990s. I mentioned that I co-directed the site. I worked in tandem with an archaeologist at the University of Tübingen in Southwest Germany named Manfred Korfmann. And for a while after we started, there was a great deal of money. People were practically showering us with money. And in 1993, when the gold that Heinrich Schliemann found at Troy in 1873, and which he had christened the gold of Priam, after the legendary king of Troy, you see it here presented on the head and shoulders of his wife, Sophia. When that was found again in the basement of the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, having been taken there at the end of World War II in 1945 by Soviet soldiers, after that was found, again, more money came our way to Troy. But then 96, 97, it began to dry up. Manfred said to me, we need to excavate some part of the mound. You're seeing here a color phase plan of the mound. The phase that I'm going to be talking about is in yellow. This is the second city of Troy, early Bronze Age, 3rd millennium BC. And he said, I want to dig another megaron, another mansion of the early Bronze Age, because if I dig that, maybe I'll find a treasure analogous to the one that Schliemann found. So he did dig that. And we did find a megaron. And of course, at that point in Troy's history, and this is true for all the ancient sites of Asia Minor in the 3rd millennium BC, the monumental buildings were constructed of mud brick. The mud brick walls of this structure still survived up to a height of 3 or 4 meters in some cases. We didn't find a treasure, but we did have an enormous mud brick structure that, of course, we had to conserve. And of course, if you don't cover mud brick, if you don't find a satisfactory solution for the conservation of mud brick, it melts just like it's ice cream. I mean, you look at some of the ziggurats in Iraq, in southern Iraq, especially after the war, it looks as if scarcely anything had been there. So the only solution we could think of was to create new mud bricks, which the workmen were happy to help us with because their houses were built of mud brick. It was a technology that hadn't changed fundamentally in 4 millennia. And so we made new mud bricks and encased the earlier mud bricks in these new mud bricks using, of course, geotextile as well. But we still had another problem, which is the phenomenal winds of Troy. You know, Homer spoke about windy Troy, and it's still the case. And this was right on the top of the mound. So we needed to create a shelter that would protect the mud brick, even even though we had used modern mud brick to protect the ancient mud brick. And this was a situation where Manfred and I had to agree to disagree. This is the canopy that was erected over the mud brick structure. You can see it clearly here, and then from a distance in the lower slides. This protected the mud brick from the winds and the rain of Troy, which are ferocious during the winter. So it has worked. And it has its own iconography. Manfred designed it so that it replicates what the form of the mound, the slope of the mound, looked like immediately prior to Heinrich Schliemann's arrival there to start excavations in 1870. And the height of the canopy reflects the height of the mound at that point as well. So it has its own iconography, and it does work well for protection. But it does look as if a hang glider has just lost its way and landed on the top of the citadel. This is not a very satisfactory solution. Every intervention we make, of course, is reversible, and my guess is that at some point this will be reversed. One of the biggest problems we face on any excavation, actually anywhere in the world, but especially in Turkey, is the problem of looting. This was especially problematic in the 1990s in Turkey because there was so much infrastructure development. All 2-lane roads became 4-lane roads. As a result, there were front-end loaders in every corner of the country as new roads were being prepared. An abundance of front-end loaders generally means an abundance of tomb robbing. The looters will find a way either to bribe the drivers or to hire the drivers, who will dig away at night at the monumental burial mounds that are located throughout Asia Minor. In the Troad in particular, where I was working, there were hundreds and hundreds of them. They haven't all been mapped. I did what I could. And one night in 1998, this happened repeatedly, but this is the example that I'm showing you. A front-end loader clawed away. Wasn't this front-end loader. I just pulled this from a John Deere advertisement, but it was the same sort of thing. A front-end loader clawed away at night at one of the burial mounds, thereby destroying the tomb chamber of early 4th century BC date and clawing away the left half of the sarcophagus contained within it. Again, probably dating to the first quarter of the 4th century BC. Once they had clawed away at and because they're digging at night, they're digging blindly. So they hear the sound of metal striking marble, they stop, they go into the tomb chamber, they see that the sarcophagus had been robbed in antiquity, and they simply went away. But they had destroyed half the tomb chamber. And this was not just any sarcophagus. An enormous amount of paint still survived on the relief of the 2 reliefs of the sarcophagus. You can see that in upper right here. Miraculously, our conservator, Donna Strawn, who was probably known to many of you, she's head of conservation at the Freer-Sackler Gallery of the Smithsonian, was able to collect the pieces and conserve all the paint. So if you were to go to the new Troy Museum, you would be able to see that the pieces have been put back together. But of course, the looting of the sarcophagus is part of its history. And so we've included a number of panels that indicate why we've left it in a kind of jagged state, to call attention to the robbery of the tumulus in which this was contained in the late 1990s, and to signal the problem with looting in Turkey. At Gordian in West Central Turkey, an hour's drive southwest of Ankara, we have some monumental stone buildings. You see here the gateway to the site dating to the 9th century BC, but the majority of the buildings are mud brick. So we had to figure out how to conserve the mud brick walls that had been badly damaged in a fire of 800 BC, and the walls had badly splayed. In particular, we had to determine how we were going to protect the tops of the walls, because we're only there for 2.5 months every summer, and the rainy season is treacherous. So we came up with something called green capping or soft capping. Once we conserve a wall, we put a mud brick frame around the top of the wall and then place clods of earth within that frame which contain shallow-rooted plants. What happens is that the roots will grow deep enough to absorb the water during the rainy season, but not so deep that they'll disturb the stability of the masonry underneath. So it's a kind of environmentally friendly solution to the problem of how you cap a wall that you've conserved. In the old days, of course, and this was true for Gordian, they would use concrete on the tops of the walls, and the concrete would expand and contract with the passage of the months. Moisture would get into the wall but couldn't get out, and so the sides would splay. Thus far, this has turned out to be a phenomenally effective solution for us, and of course, very cheap. At Gordian, we have 140 burial mounds that surround the site, more than you'll find at any other site except Sardis in West Central Turkey. The difference between us and Sardis is that the Sardis tomb chambers are stone, ours are wooden. And within this particular mound, but our predecessors from Penn were able to find the tomb chamber intact, made of wood, juniper, pine, and cedar, dating to 740 BC, and containing the body of the father of King Midas, whom we think of as a legendary king, turning everything he touched into gold, but he was a very powerful historical king living between 740 and 700 BC. This was his first major construction. The problem with Tumulus MM is not the wooden tomb chamber. That has been relatively stable. We've had Jessie Johnson of the Smithsonian as our chief conservator, and she's been able to keep it in a state of good preservation. Our problem was with the mound that encased it, and you're seeing that here on the right. We weren't sure how to handle the mound. Initially, we did nothing to preserve its shape. And so in doing nothing, an enormous number of weeds and brush grew on top of the mound, and the sheep in the area would climb the mound and eat all of the vegetation in the course of the months that they were grazing. What this meant is that they ate every bit of vegetation. And so when the rainy season came, the water began to create serious erosion channels in the mound and began changing its shape and also, of course, its stability. And within that mound, we have the oldest standing wooden building in the world. And so obviously we didn't want anything to happen to that. And so by extension, we couldn't have anything compromise the integrity of the mound that contained it. We realized that if we didn't put a fence up, that the erosion would continue because the sheep would continue grazing on the mound. So we put up a fence, and the sheep couldn't get in. The brush grew to a phenomenal size. And when tourists came to the site, they would obviously stare at the mound, which is the second largest burial mound in Turkey. And everyone in Turkey smokes, even I did for 20 years. And it was only a question of time, I now know in retrospect, that's before someone would throw their lit cigarette on the mound. And so all the brush would burn. This happened year after year. So we didn't see clearly an easy solution. We couldn't take down the fence because then that would increase erosion. We couldn't put up a fence because that would guarantee that the brush on the mound would burn and would create other problems. So of course we reached a compromise. The fence is up for part of the year, but not for other parts of the year. So the sheep can graze, but not completely. The brush will grow, but not especially high. So that solution has enabled us to maintain the stability of this burial mound as well as the others. One of the big problems we've had is that many of these burial mounds are on other people's property. They're on farms, and the fields that the farmers have been plowing are getting closer and closer to the burial mounds. You can see that here. This is the earliest burial mound in Turkey, dating to 850 BC. And you can see how close to the top of the mound the fields are coming, to a point where some of the burial mounds have actually disappeared from view. This is something that we're working very closely and intensively with the Ministry of Culture on, trying to get the site declared or trying to get the site inscribed in the World Heritage List of UNESCO so that we can develop some legislation that will protect the tumuli. The ancient world has become much more closely associated with the modern world, especially in the last 20 years, during the last 2 decades of armed conflict. Sometimes it's easier for us to understand modern conflict by viewing it through the lens of ancient conflict, especially the Trojan War. So it's not uncommon to see books such as Achilles in Vietnam, Odysseus in America, or Ajax in Iraq, some of which go back and forth between the Trojan War and what has been happening in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. We now have programs entitled Theater of War, where veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan will perform scenes from 5th century BC Greek plays, primarily dealing with the Trojan War, as a way of dealing with post-traumatic stress, witnessing the post-traumatic stress and literally living again the post-traumatic stress of Homeric warriors as expressed in any number of plays about the Trojan War, Ajax in particular. And they then compare that with the post-traumatic stress that they've experienced in Iraq and Afghanistan. So everything old has become new again. And we've been reminded of this continually because of the phenomenal loss of cultural property that we've seen in those areas of armed conflict, as the US has sent soldiers throughout Iraq, throughout Afghanistan, and to many other places as well, some of which we don't even know about. Here, by the way, is one of these ziggurats that, as I said, if you don't take care of Mudbrick, it's like melted ice cream. The soldiers initially weren't getting any kind of training in conservation or in the history and archaeology of the regions to which they were being deployed. Meanwhile, museums were being hit by rockets, as you see on the right with the Kabul Archaeological Museum. Libraries were being burned, archaeological sites were being plundered with a rapidity that no one had seen within our lifetimes. When I realized that the Department of Defense wasn't giving any kind of pre-deployment training in cultural heritage protection, in the fundamentals of conservation, or in the history and archaeology of the regions to which they were going, I asked the US Central Command for permission to inaugurate a lecture program under the auspices of the Archaeological Institute of America, wherein we archaeologists would go to military bases, and if they would let us, to Iraq and Afghanistan, and to give cultural heritage briefings to the soldiers prior to their departure. It took 9 months, but we got the program approved in 2004. Then we began going to Camp Lejeune, lecturing to the Marines, to Fort Bliss, the Army, and to the Air Force Center at Fort Dixon, Central New Jersey, as well as a lot more. These are just 3 with which we started. And eventually they let me go to Iraq and Afghanistan. So this is a shot of me in Ghazni in southern Afghanistan, where we were reviewing historic preservation strategic plans for the area, because so many of the monuments were mud brick. I worked in tandem with Lori Rush, and still do work in tandem with Lori Rush. She is the archaeologist at Fort Drum in New York. Lori developed a series of playing cards that we handed out at every pre-deployment training session we did. They each contain lessons in conservation and cultural heritage protection. And I single one out for special attention. How would we feel if someone destroyed the torch of the Statue of Liberty? What we wanted the soldiers to understand is the immense pride that the people of Iraq and Afghanistan and the other areas to which they were deploying feel in the ancient culture of their region. in some respects, it's all they have, that fierce pride in what the country had once been. This has worked extremely well, and we did these lectures for 12 years. I still do them for ROTC. When we started, they would only give us 20 minutes. Admittedly, 20 minutes is not a long enough time to teach the soldiers the fundamentals of conservation, as well as the history and archaeology of both Iraq and Afghanistan. But by the time we had acquired some credibility, they gave us a full day, which is still not enough time, but nevertheless better than what we started with. And of course, we realized that we could use the Penn Museum. Many other museums have done this as well, with the soldiers who were in pre-deployment training at Fort Dix. We're fortunate in having a lot of material from Iraq, less so Afghanistan. And so we were able to use the material from Iraq in our pre-deployment training. And Fort Dix is only about an hour's drive from Penn. And so we made the museum literally part of the curriculum that they were following. Of course, at the same time, there were a lot of organizations that were being developed. The Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage in Erbil in northern Iraq, where we train Iraqi conservators in best practices in conservation, because there are areas, many areas, most areas, which are at risk, to which we cannot go. But obviously they can and should be going there. And they weren't getting the proper training and conservation to equip them with the tools and techniques that they needed. This has been ongoing now for over a decade and has been very successful. Penn Cultural Heritage Center was also inaugurated. We've in particular trained conservators, museum workers in Syria, in the fundamentals of protecting their museums, especially when there are times of armed conflict. And then, of course, you're all familiar with Mosaicon, the wonderful program started by Roberto Nardi, whom you see on the left, involving the Getty and ICCM and ICROM in Rome, focused in particular on conservation of mosaics. What all of this has done, I think, is make us think outside the box in a way that we weren't before. So at Penn, for example, we started a program with the Veterans Administration Hospital called Eternal Soldier, where we have a program called Veterans Read Homer. And we use this working with therapists at the hospital. We use tours of the museum, focusing on ancient Troy, the Trojan War. And we do these Veterans Read Homer programs where we talk about post-traumatic stress on the battlefield during the Trojan War and on the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan, again, as part of their therapy. And this has worked enormously well for them to see that the feelings of hopelessness and suicide, of rage that they have experienced, still are experiencing, were experienced by warriors in the 8th century BC. To see it on a diachronic spectrum helps them deal with the issues. And it's been enormously educational for us as well. As I said, all of this, at least for me, all of this armed conflict of the last 2 decades made us think outside the box. So we thought about groups that we weren't reaching in our programs, not just veterans and soldiers, but also the blind. So many museums, and this is intensified, I think, in the last decade, have developed more interesting programs for the blind than we ever had before. And of course, for something like this, we need conservators as our partners to help us understand what can be used with those visitors who are blind, because they will need to touch the objects and what objects are off limits. So this too has been a wonderful experience moving forward. It's easy in some cases to know what to conserve. In other cases, it's a more difficult decision. I experienced this when I was in southern Iraq. I was at Ur, according to ancient traditions, the home of the biblical patriarch Abraham. And there's a mud brick structure at Ur, which is billed as the house of Abraham. You're seeing it in upper left and lower left. This is a 40-room mansion that has nothing to do with Abraham or antiquity. It was built by Saddam Hussein in 1999 because he knew that the year 2000 was the Jubilee year for the Vatican. The Pope had announced his intention to visit biblical sites. And Saddam Hussein assumed that if he built a House of Abraham, the Pope would come to Iraq. His status would rise to an extent because he was getting a high profile visitor. And at least during that visit, the bombs would stop falling. So what do you do with a monument like this that is pure political propaganda? When I was touring Ur in 2004, you see me in upper right with a ziggurat of Ur behind us, I was talking to the archaeological supervisor of the district of Nasiriyah, where Ur is located, a wonderful man who's now received his PhD in archaeology from SUNY Stony Brook and was until recently Minister of Culture in Iraq. But when we were standing next to the House of Abraham, and he told me the story of Saddam Hussein, I said, "You're obviously going to change the text panels to reflect this." And he said, "No, we're going to destroy it." And I said, "Don't destroy it. This is part now of the biography of the site, in the same way in which when a building falls down and you've conserved it through anastylosis, the destruction of the building is part of a biography, and you shouldn't try to hide it." So I said, "Why don't you leave it the way it is, but make it the center of a didactic display that would explain how ancient Mesopotamian culture was co-opted by a recent ruler of Iraq as part of his political propaganda. Make it an educational experience rather than a destruction." And so you see me making that argument. The State Department photographer caught me right as I was saying to him what I have just finished saying to you, and you can see from his body language how that idea was received. He said only 4 words when I finished: "I want it destroyed," but it still stands, at least as of the last time I checked. What about statues of dictators? Are they cultural property? Should they be destroyed? If they shouldn't be destroyed, what should be their fate? When they're pulled down, should they be conserved? What should we do with statues of Saddam Hussein, of Lenin, of Ferdinand Marcos, which obviously is a conservation nightmare? This is a colossal head of Ferdinand Marcos in the cliffs of Tuba in the Philippines. You see it before a bomb exploded his orbital region, and then after the bomb exploded his orbital region. What should you do? Should you call in conservators to help with this? Should it be completely cleared? These are not easy solutions. And of course, conservators only have so much time and so much energy. You can't conserve everything. There has to be a priority system. What about something like this? I saw this when I was in Baghdad in 2009, a mosaic of Saddam Hussein with the flag of Texas painted on his head. I mean, there were a lot of strange things in Baghdad at that time. A mosaic of George Bush in the vestibule of the Al Rashid Hotel in Baghdad that Saddam Hussein had installed so that anyone who walked in the hotel would be walking on the head of George Bush. Walking on the head of your enemy is the most disgraceful thing you can do. What do we do with objects like this? Do we conserve this mosaic of George Bush with the inscription saying Bush is a criminal in 2 languages? Do we conserve the mosaic of Saddam Hussein? We've had to cope with similar issues in our own country recently, especially in the South, as we deal with the fate of Confederate monuments. Should they be destroyed? Should there be a kind of damnatio, where they have been battered and they're left in a battered state, sort of like an ancient Roman damnatio memoriae? Should they disappear completely? Should they be the nucleus of new educational exhibits discussing slavery, injustice, racism, etc.? If they are to be the center of new educational exhibits, should that be in the same place where they have been erected, or should it be in a special museum? And if it's in a museum, who's going to build that museum and who's going to pay for it? taxpayers paying for a museum of those who promoted slavery? Will anyone feel comfortable paying for that? These are all issues that have no easy answer, but with which we have to deal. There's been an enormous amount of iconoclasm of these monuments, of many monuments, all over the world, but especially in the US in the last decade. And all of us have had to figure out how we're going to approach this with our students, with our colleagues, with journalists who ask us what should be done. For me, all of these things, including the images of Saddam Hussein, are cultural property. As cultural property, and as an archaeologist, I feel obliged to keep them from being destroyed. Since they're cultural property, they're part of history. For me as an archaeologist, there's no excuse for the destruction of history, period. If they have been and continue to be used to promote racism, sexism, homophobia, injustice of any kind, then how do you handle it? I suppose what I would advocate is their placement in a museum and new text panels placed around them that present them as educational components of a very complex social network, a very convoluted social network since the founding of this country. In some cases that's happening, in more cases it's not. In some cases though, people have been adapting some very creative solutions. They haven't been destroying, they haven't completely removed the monument, they haven't hammered away at the monument. They have very cleverly used light displays to turn the monument into an educational facility. As you see here with the Confederate statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, where at night projected onto it are heroes of the period of slavery. In this case, Harriet Tubman, with her famous expression, "Slavery is the next thing to hell," and with the initials of Black Lives Matter superimposed through light on the horse. This, for me, is a very clever solution. It's redefining the meaning of the monument without completely obliterating it. I always like to stop with this slide, and I'm getting to the end of my time and I want to leave time for questions as well. This is a photograph that was taken in 2001 after the Taliban had been jettisoned from Kabul. It's the entrance to the Kabul Archaeological Museum, a sign in two languages, in Dari and in English: "A nation stays alive when its culture stays alive." And I like to think that all of us, but especially you as conservators, are keeping culture alive, and thus the nations. Thank you.